from the Denver Broncos Media Center, welcome to Broncos Country Tonight with Ryan Edwards and Benjamin Allbright.
Welcome to Broncos Country Tonight. A lot of things happening around the Broncos, around the NFL here in the offseason. Phase 2 workouts beginning. We'll get to that here in a little bit. The latest with Dayshawn Hamilton. Also, a lot of things flying around out there. We'll set that straight. But first, Ben, let's start with the Broncos right tackle. And it's funny, the last time we did the TV show, we were talking about Ryan Pope and how they made that signing. And it's not obviously going to preclude them from going out and adding any more offensive tackles because they clearly needed to add depth there. They signed Bobby Massie to a one-year deal, $4 million, and then they turn around and sign Cam Fleming to a one-year deal. And I remember you talking about on the Broncos Country Tonight show, which, by the way, you can check out, broncoscountrytonight.com. I remember you talking about how if they did decide to do Cam Fleming, bring Cam Fleming in, that would be more of a developmental kind of situation. What did you think about what they did at right tackle?
Well, you could have had one Dennis Kelly or two right tackles in Massie and Fleming, and they opted to go that route. Now, they did sign Pope, and we talked about that being a procedural depth move just to get a body in there. They do like Calvin Anderson, but this gives them an opportunity to explore some more talent and edge a little bit more against injury. Bobby Massie has been hurt at times, so it gives them some versatility there into the ability to do both. Fleming is a little bit more versatile, a little bit more athletic. Massie's a little bit stronger technician. But it's, I think it's a situation where you looked at Dennis Kelly and you said, well, this guy didn't allow a sack last year, and that's pretty good. But in the end, does this guy, is it better to push all our chips in on this one player, or can we get the same amount out of two, get two guys for the price of one and kind of go from there? And that's really what in the end it came down to.
Well, and I like that. I actually like that approach. The Broncos have not really done it that way in the past. They've usually tried to get the one guy, the Menelik Watson, Juwan James. They try to get the one guy here, pay them a significant amount of money, at least an amount of money that would say that you're our starter. In this case, they've kind of opened it up. And we know Calvin Anderson is still in the mix here. He was going to be the swing coming into the season, but he's going to have an opportunity to commit or to be the starter there, right tackle. But the fact is, because you don't have a commit necessarily with any one of these guys, it really opens up opportunity, and maybe, just maybe, the Broncos might get better overall performance out of that position as a result. Yeah,
I think that overall, not trying to push all your chips in on one spot is a better strategy. In what George Paton is trying to do in constructing this roster is not have a single point of failure. You go back and you look, and with John Elway, we did have that at times. The Juwan James situation. If that went down, all of a sudden you were in a world of hurt. And so I think that George Paton has kind of adopted a business strategy in not having a single point of failure on this team. Someone goes down, we have the opportunity to put someone in right behind them, and we've got the flexibility and the money to be able to do that. Someone that's qualified, not reaching for the bottom of the roster. And so no more Menelik Watsons, no more Juwan James type situations. We're going to make sure we've got the insurance policy behind them going forward, and I think it's a smart move.
Yeah, they're likely going to be drafting at that position as soon as next year. I mean, you've set yourself up for that. Even Calvin Anderson does prove out to be the guy. You might still draft some depth there. These are both one-year contracts, low level of commitment. I like I think Bobby Massie is probably the favorite to win the job, even if, though, he may not necessarily be the guy for the entire season. I feel like he's just the more polished of the group of right tackles that's available, even though I know Calvin Anderson's been working really hard this offseason.
Yeah, and Calvin may still win the job, but you've created an insurance system that allows you to, if he does or doesn't, it allows you to move forward and have that kind of faith and belief that no matter what happens, we have the next guy right there behind them. And so I think that really when it comes to how they're going to play out this season, you look at last season and how much of a lost season that was due to injury and not having the depth behind at certain positions. Now all of a sudden you're covered.
Yeah, it certainly seems like the Broncos wanted to give themselves that opportunity. And as we mentioned so many times, right tackle is kind of a Bermuda Triangle for the Broncos. They have not been able to figure that out. I don't know if this is necessarily the answer long term, but it is at least for the short term. What do you think about the overall offensive line now? Like, as we sit here today, and I guess if nothing else, you've bought yourself some availability. Like, maybe you don't have bought the high-end production that you ultimately wanted when you brought in Juwan James, but you brought yourself in availability. At least one of these guys can play it to a level that hopefully will bring a performance that you need, because right now the offensive line has suffered as a result of having that sort of turnstile there.
Yeah, but I think if you look along the offensive line, what they've done the last couple of years and where they are now, it's a strength of the team. Garrett Bowles on the left side is finally morphed into what they want. Dalton Risner, still Dalton Risner. You drafted Quinn Meinertz to be the backup, or maybe even the starter at center, but at least the backup at all three of those positions. You drafted Lloyd Cushenberry last year, who had a solid campaign but needs to improve some functional strength stuff. On the right side, you paid money to Graham Glasgow, but you got Netani Moody right behind him that you really like. And then on the right tackle, that was the question mark. And if you believe in Mike Munchak as a coach and his ability to coach these guys up, why not take more dart throws and put it on that rather than spend it all on one guy and risk the injury to him, meaning that you only have Calvin Anderson, and if he gets hurt, then what are you going to do? So, again, I think it's a smart strategy in terms of what you're trying to do here. Hopefully it pans out.
Were you surprised they added Cam Fleming? Because last time we talked on the show, you were kind of thinking that maybe they might try to stay a little bit cheaper even there at the position because they might be hoping for, say, I don't know, an Aaron Rodgers become available.
Well, it's interesting because I had mentioned Fleming 2 weeks ago as the guy, and I kind of was like, because everything I was hearing was like they were kind of eyeballing that. And then as it came closer, I started kind of getting the message that, hey, this is if Cam signed, he's kind of a little bit more of an upside guy than he is necessarily compete for the starting job, air quotes. And so to me, that was like, okay, we got to add another guy, Bobby Massie, right price, right guy, that kind of thing. So the original messaging that I was getting from the Broncos, not surprised. In the end, a little bit surprised because of the later messaging of, right price, right guy with Massie.
But again, I think the point that we make here with this whole thing is you have three guys competing for that position, all less than what Kelly would have been asking for in a contract.
Yes, and that ultimately at the end, that's kind of the decision maker where we're going. Yeah, Kelly's a quality piece, but pushing all in on that piece versus having multiple options and having this team prepared for this season with plenty of depth, I think was the better move.
All right, something to continue to track. When we come back, the latest with Dayshawn Hamilton. There were reports flying all over the place last week. We'll get to it next.
Welcome back to Broncos Country Tonight. Here are Ryan Edwards and Benjamin Allbright.
All right, welcome back to Broncos Country Tonight. Let's talk about Dayshawn Hamilton. And last week, there were all sorts of things flying around. Initially, there was reports that he was waived. Then there were reports that there was an injury there. And we had already said for a while there at wide receiver, it's a pretty stacked room. Dayshawn Hamilton coming into the final year of his contract, do a little over $2 million in cap hit this year. So there was already a wonder of, hey, he's going to be at best your fifth wide receiver making over $2 million. So he's already going to be competing for a job there. But then we get the news that he tore an ACL, and that obviously puts him out for the season. So it's tough news. Obviously, the Broncos have had some really brutal injuries, including Juwan James, we talked about in the last segment, now with Dayshawn Hamilton. But what can you tell us about the latest with Dayshawn Hamilton? And you had reported that there was an actual trade potentially in place right before all this happened.
Yeah, the Broncos were originally going to waive Dayshawn Hamilton, kind of leaked it through the media that they were going to do that to see if they could fish for offers.
Which happens all the time.
Yeah, this is a normal practice. And so they were fishing for offers and got some, more than one team actually. Was involved in that. Philadelphia, the Titans, and the Niners. The Niners had the most attractive package and was trending toward a done deal with them for a day 3 pick. I believe it was a 6-rounder that would have been, conditional. And so, they were looking at trying to get that deal completed when the news came down that Dayshawn had torn his ACL. And so that obviously put the kibosh on that trade. The Niners have since signed Marquis Lee as a receiver, and obviously an indicator that they're heavily in the market for some type of possession-type receiver. For Dayshawn, it's going to be interesting. For the NFL Players Association to put the eye strictly back on the Broncos with the Juwan James situation as well. Dayshawn away from the facility when he did that. And so it's an interesting setup and scenario in terms of the Players Association firmly, and the players around the league firmly having their eye on the Broncos in terms of how that's going to go. And go from there. In terms of Dayshawn, I believe he'll be put on the NFI, and the Broncos will, eventually waive him with an injury settlement if they decide to do a settlement with him. I can tell you that Dayshawn was beloved by the organization. Even when the trade negotiations are going on, it was kind of a hard thing because he's just one of those guys that comes in and does it right every day.
Yes.
And so that's, he was loved by the organization. And so I wouldn't be surprised, whereas James did not get an injury settlement, I would not be surprised to see Dayshawn get one.
Right, and that's a good point you bring up there, is like sometimes I think fans get a little bit of the tunnel vision on these players. They think about it in terms of, well, I've only seen the on-field production, I've seen the drops, and I've seen the inconsistent play, and you think that overall that's how the organization feels as well. Look, he would get more opportunities if he was producing at a higher level. I think that we know that. That's just the baseline of the NFL. But there's more to it. There's more to being a good locker room teammate. There's more to helping out the receiver room. There were times that Drew Lock was leaning on Dayshawn Hamilton to be one of his primary guys. Now, it wasn't consistent, and obviously you've made some upgrades there. Cortland Sutton's coming back. Your top 4 guys are more or less spoken for. You get to Deontay Spencer. You get to Tyree Cleveland. It's tough. It's a tough room to make it. It was even a tough room last year. He was a roster bubble guy, either way. But I'm glad you brought up the point about how he's viewed internally versus what I think some fans assume he's viewed as. Right.
And the productivity has been hit or miss with him. And there have been times where, he didn't live up to what they had hoped that he would become.
Not. Right.
But he's Penn State's all-time leading receiver, and he was a guy that worked well in the locker room, loved by his teammates, and loved by the front office, too. It's rare that you get a player that's kind of loved by both. Some of those locker room culture guys are not exactly loved by the front office and all that kind of thing. Dayshawn is one of those guys, just nobody had a bad word to say about the guy. So here's hoping he recovers well and wherever the next thing on his career is. But an unfortunate injury when he could have gotten another start in San Francisco.
Yeah, and the timing is so tough there too, because you think just an entire year, you just say a year. I mean, we're bumping up right up against free agency next year. So just you kind of think, that's tough news for Dayshawn, for a guy that, again, by all accounts, did it the right way here inside the building and did not quite work out there as far as on the field production, at least the way you'd ultimately hope. But the Broncos have made investment, and it does kind of bring up the whole point about wide receivers going forward in the draft. And I know we're going to have this conversation in the offseason about Cortland Sutton. He does have some pressure to put on this year to perform at the level that we are starting to see him break out as. But the fact is, you're seeing like every year becomes a really good opportunity to get wide receivers. Eventually there's going to be a cap. Eventually we're not going to see the greatest wide receiver draft of all time. But the last 2 years have been an indication that wide receiver is a position that you can take at either premium pick or even in day 2 and get production.
Well, yeah, and more wide receivers are getting more reps at the collegiate level because teams run those spread offenses. So more guys are coming prepared, and you can find value even on into day 3 at that position where, maybe you couldn't at times before. Next year's class is going to be loaded. You have a lot of guys that opted out, went back to school, all that kind of stuff. So next year's class is going to be loaded as well. I don't think that's slowing down anytime soon. So just unfortunate timing for Dayshawn Hamilton.
Yeah, no doubt. And then that also affects what the market in free agency. We saw that this was last year. Teams are starting to say, well, wait a minute. I can get a cost-controlled wide receiver for 4 years, or I can take one of these guys in free agency that might come with a little bit of baggage there. And that's tough. That's a tough point for most organizations, because unless you get a guy that can immediately help your team, it'll end up being like a Marquis Lee who signed with the 49ers after the draft, after a certain point in free agency, basically where you don't have to guarantee certain parts of their contract. There's a reason why guys are getting signed right now. That would end up being where he goes.
Yeah, and so that's one of those kinds of things. Like Dayshawn's going to have to now compete with all that. And, oh, by the way, coming back off an ACL tear, it's going to be a lot tougher for him to do that via free agency. So feel for him. Wish him nothing but the best. But, stinks because he, like I said, could have had another career-boosting opportunity or maybe career resurgence, as it were, with the Niners.
Yeah, no doubt about that. All right, when we come back, we're going to shift gears to what is actually happening out there on the practice field. Phase 2 of the Broncos offseason has begun. Get to that next.
Welcome back to Broncos Country Tonight. Here are Ryan Edwards and Benjamin Allbright.
All right, final segment here at Broncos Country Tonight. Phase 2 of the offseason for the Broncos is underway. And as we understand it, for the first day, had about 75 players out there on the practice field of the 88-man roster, which is a pretty good turnout. We kind of wondered a little bit about what we would see in that turnout, but Broncos, especially majority of the offensive players, are all out there. Now, the thing I want to actually talk about is what's the value here of the phase 2. And this has been somewhat convoluted over the last decade plus, right? Because it's been voluntold instead of voluntary. Well, now you're seeing maybe a little bit of result of some of the off-field injuries, but even just a result of being a 5-win team, a lot of these guys are wanting to show up and they're wanting to work, including the quarterbacks are out there.
Yeah, but I mean, again, a lot of this stuff right now isn't even field work. You're just lifting, going through the motions and doing that. It's mostly conditioning. And so showing up right now really isn't that big a deal. And honestly, if you were going to boycott, you would boycott after this. Like, this is the thing where you would show up for, so you're still covered under insurance by the team when you're working out. If you really want to, if you're really wanting to leverage the team, that's the maximum effective way to do it. So I think that right now those numbers, and especially with the Dayshawn thing and the Jawan James thing, I think that those numbers are a little boosted by that. I know the optics of it had a lot of the players kind of concerned. They didn't want to boycott being a 5-win team, but they were at the epicenter or the forefront of being the team that was going to do this. They were out front, and other teams kind of followed their lead in terms of boycotting these things. So it is interesting as the league has kind of an eye on that. I was told last week after Dayshawn's deal that expect high attendance numbers because players are coming back and like, look, I can't do this. I understand what we're fighting for, but I can't not be covered.
Well, by the way, when I say quarterbacks, Teddy Bridgewater's not here just yet, but that's more because he's working out some things, and he'll be here. Yes. It's not like he's staying away intentionally, but yeah, I mean, you have Drew Lock out there. I'm glad you brought this up. It's something we talked about a ton when all this was happening a month or two ago, when all these reports are coming out that the Broncos were going to boycott and a lot of teams were going to boycott some of the off-season programming. We said, hey, listen, this isn't the end of the world because most of the stuff you're doing is conditioning and weightlifting, and you're doing some film work. But you can do film work from really anywhere as long as you have a chance to work with the coaches, and they obviously did that even during phase 1 with the coaches during Zoom. So the Broncos found a way, and I almost feel as though because of what happened last year, you learned, and this is through a lot of businesses, you learned the versatility of being able to find a way to get it done, find a way to get some version of off-season training done. And I think that's ultimately where the NFLPA, the Players Association, is kind of coming from here, is they're thinking about the longevity of their bodies, and they're thinking, hey, we learned a way to get this thing done in the offseason in a way that we don't have to be out on the field. But as you said, things are coming up now where guys are learning, no, actually, maybe it's better to be at the facility, developing some camaraderie, and covering ourselves with insurance.
Yeah, and I think both sides have a point here.
Yeah, agreed.
I think it's one of those rare situations where both sides have a very valid point, and how to work that out really is what needs to be done here. So I think that if I'm the league and if I'm teams, the way that we're doing this, we're saying, hey, come work out and lift here so that you're covered under the insurance, and we'll start doing the virtual implementation of some of the stuff. It's an easy give and take for everybody here. We can do the virtual stuff for some of the installs, and we'll be better off, and you don't have to worry about tearing up your body, while we're doing all this. So I think that there's some give and take to be had here. I think that there's an easy compromise that just hasn't reached that point yet. And right now, both sides are kind of at war, and the Players Association is going to lose because, quite frankly, players not being covered while they're working out away from the facility is showing huge financial loss already.
But there are some teams that are individually trying to meet their players halfway. They're doing some things where they're actually not requiring mandatory minicamp, saying, hey, show up here in May, and we'll get something done. We'll get some on-field, obviously not full pads, some on-field work done, and you guys can be done for the month of June. There's a few teams that have already come out and more or less said that. There's some teams saying, hey, we'll be in sandals the entire time. Don't worry about it. This is not going to be the hardcore stuff that we're so used to back in the days of Mike Shanahan and Josh McDaniels and that era of football where the offseason was really sometimes padded practices during that time. So we are seeing that transition. I think that the misunderstanding tends to come from some of the rhetoric that gets kind of thrown back and forth between the two sides.
Yeah, and I think that's what it is. I think everybody's kind of hyperbolic with the rhetoric right now because that's where they are. Everybody wants to stake their claim in the ground. Reality is there is easy compromises here. There are easy compromises here. It's just a question of getting people together to meet them. And the problem from, and I've talked to a couple of people in different front offices from the player side, is just they seem like they're hardlining on this, whereas the front offices want to be amenable and want to help out, want to do what they can to make things as easy on the players, because the last thing you want is guys injured. That hurts you as an organization. So they want to do things to help out with all that as well, but they can't begin to negotiate until some of these hardline stances evaporate a little bit.
I'm with you on that. By the way, out there last week for the rookie minicamp and seeing some of the shots, the video the Broncos social put out there of Cortland Sutton hanging out with Tim Patrick and Jerry Jeudy, being out there, the rookies. I tell you what, man, I got pretty fired up. I got pretty fired up seeing actual players out there on the practice field. And it's amazing kind of going back to like what you don't know what you don't have until you don't have it anymore. that's the feeling I had watching these guys out on the practice field of how much I missed that. And I wondered for the players how much they actually missed that too.
Yeah, it probably have to a degree. I mean, there's certain camaraderie things that get built up from those kinds of situations, but it's anytime that you've been without something for a while and you kind of get to see it again, and you get to experience it again. I think that helps stir up some of that. Nostalgia is an interesting thing. It's an interesting motivator. So we'll see if that doesn't help out with that.
I know the fans are going to be really excited because they're going to have an opportunity, hopefully this offseason during training camp, to get up there and check out the players and see them actually working. And I don't know, it's just like you realize how much you miss those kind of normalcy moments. Maybe took them for granted, I'm just saying. And I would say I was one of those people in the dead heat of summer going out to training camp like, oh my gosh, another day grinding out here. But in the same time, when you don't have it, man, you certainly love it.
Yeah, and you and I were the only people who got to do it all last year. So media, fans, all of them, I think hopefully they'll be able to get allowed back and see what we saw last year.
Nice little mini flex there. I'm here for it. All right, there you go. That does it for us on Broncos Country Tonight. For Benjamin Allbright, I'm Ryan Edwards. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching Broncos Country Tonight. Tune in to Broncos TV every weeknight at 6:30, right here on KTVD Channel 20.